But I want to thank you, Harvey, and I want to thank particularly Dr. Sessions and Alice for the encouragement to come here and to make it possible. Having left public service some 5 years ago, I think this is the first time that anyone has asked me to speak. And it's the first time I've got a free meal. So it's really quite a night for me, and I appreciate it very much. Let me start by saying that my achievements in the sporting field actually become better and better because all my teammates are now dead. And as a consequence of that, you have no idea how brilliant I was. There wasn't anyone that would stand up to me. And I set standards that remain unattained by anybody else since 1956. And so I think it was a modest introduction that you gave me. Because my achievements were actually much greater than my achievements on the cello were also much greater than described, and I'm only sorry that I was not asked to bring perhaps next year you can advance the introduction and let me come here with a few friends to entertain you. But seriously, one of the things that I think was of great importance in my career was starting in a law firm in Australia. And the reason that I skipped out of law was I was involved in the RCA Zenith antitrust action, which I'm sure you don't remember because it was 1956. But my boss had a heart attack the night before evidence was being taken. And so as a very, very young lawyer, I was put into this case. And on the first day, I was totally brilliant. Every question that was asked of me by the American lawyer, I would say it's on page 675 in the third paragraph, and it's amended in page 961, and he was so impressed by me. The next day, he said to me, "What is the current ratio of such and such a company?" And I had not the slightest idea what a current ratio was. And I took out the annual report looking for the current ratio, was unable to find it. And he said, "What the hell is the current ratio?" I still couldn't do it. And then, with far greater invective, he said something to me which I will not repeat here, but suggested that I go to the Harvard Business School, which I'd never heard of. And that night I was so embarrassed, I wrote to the Harvard Business School in Boston, Massachusetts, and 4 months later was there. I'm still not quite sure why I went to the Harvard Business School, but it changed my life, and I moved over away from the law because everyone was so clever that I didn't think I'd make a good career. And so I went into the downside of finance and somehow made a living since then. But let me get back to the subject which I had suggested to Bill I might talk about. And it's a difficult subject at the end of the day, as I see you're all very tired, and one or two drinks, I hope. But the point is that for the last years, and for the last 30 years of the last century, we lived in a world in which it was very clear that the rich were rich and the poor were poor. In the year 2000, we had 1 billion people on the planet, 6 billion people. And the 1 billion people had 80% of the global income. In fact, the G7 had 65% of the global income. And the other 5 billion had 20% of the global income. And that included China, India, and all the developing countries. And it started to change around that time. And my generation found it difficult to adjust to that. And looking around the room, there are a few people who might share that history. And what is now happening is that by 2050, the 80-20 will change to 35-65. The billion people will grow to 1,250,000,000. The 5 billion in the developing world will grow to 8 billion. so that by the year 2050 you'll have a world something over 9 billion. The billion will have grown to 1,250,000,000. And instead of 80% of the world income, they'll have 35%. And the other 8 billion will have 65%. Now that's hugely significant, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of a change in the structure of the world. Asia will have of the order of 55% of global income. China and India together will have somewhere between 45 and 50% of global income, which they last had in the year 1800. And we are coming into a world which, as you probably know, the Asians are preparing for. This year, 415,000 Chinese, new Chinese, will go and study abroad. 200,000, 225,000 will be coming to study in the United States. 110,000 Indians will be coming here to study. We have the sum total of 13,000 students going to study in China, and a little less than 10,000 studying in India. Showing, I think, not a huge recognition of the change in the world. Nor indeed outside New York and California, where a lot of kids who have well-endowed parents are studying Chinese and really getting an introduction to the world that is coming. But if you go to the Midwest, and if you go to many others of the states, the educational system is still geared to English history, American history, and Asia to an extent exists, but not a hell of a lot. California, of course, is changing more because of the Asian population on the West Coast, but the readiness and the willingness of people to change for a world which is surely going to happen is sadly not there. I might add that my own original country, Australia, is also getting a lot of benefit from this because the third, in fact the first largest intellectual income is coming from education, mainly from Asians. So that is certainly one of the things. You have an education system which is in vast need of change and has not been changing. The issue of poverty is critically important. In 2008, we had nearly 20% of the world living under $1.25 a day. That's not a lot of money. We had 50% of the world living under $2.50 a day. Something that we don't very often think about here. And 80% of the world living under $10 a day. This is the way the other half, or the other 80%, has lived. And when you think about how we should look at our planet, all too often, as I discovered in my work at the bank, which lasted 10 years, talking to leaders of the developed world about these changes and about the critical importance of dealing with them for the next generation, you were met with a sort of blank stare. And there were some reasons for that, significantly because of the issue of corruption. I started at the bank in 1995, and I became aware of just how pernicious was the issue of corruption. And so I wrote my annual meeting speech for 1996, in which I made reference to corruption. And the General Counsel, having seen the draft, pulled me outside my office. He wouldn't meet me in my office. He took me out into the anteroom, took me over into a corner and said, "Mr. President," he'd always called me Jim before that, "Mr. President," and in hushed tones he said, "You cannot use the C word in your speech." I said, "Ibrahim, what the hell is the C word?" He said, "Corruption." And I said, "Why can't I use the C word in my speech?" He said, "Because half the members of your board represent countries that are corrupt." And no one at the World Bank has ever talked about corruption before. In fact, no one in the official institutions of the world had ever raised the issue of corruption, ever. And I then went on and in the speech talked about the cancer of corruption. And since that time, of course, it spawned an industry. And there are some 50 or 60 people now at the World Bank working on it, as there are in just about every international agency. And corruption has become an important element in the international financial field at all levels. But it's still not beaten. And so the issue of corruption generally is something that I'm sure, with the brilliance that there is in this room, will be something that you will not only fight, recognize, but I hope take part in beating down. And it is an issue that I have to say, in terms of the structure of the planet, is something that is inadequately appraised and inadequately dealt with, but which is hugely demanding in terms of groups such as this to come forward and fight. For me, it is the most pernicious aspect of the way in which countries are run today, as of course are the issues of the structure of the legal system and indeed the carrying out of legal issues, which, if I had the time, I'd take a tour of the world, but they're hugely important as you look around the world and see the variations in the development. And by the way, not as a trivial issue, but particularly today in the Middle East, the issue of governance and the issue of the legal system is becoming a very serious impediment to many of the ways in which I think one could deal with the Middle East. And I might add that on the Middle East, at this moment, we have very new and very different social issues which are occurring. As we see two things happening: 30 to 40% of the population being under the age of 30. Very different from what we've known before. And secondly, instead of, when I started in the business, the individuals would be referring to themselves by their national origin and by their national history, today with internet and with cell phones, you now have groups not of the individual countries, but of Arabs, Arab students, Arab professionals, because there is a very different coming together in terms of those communities. And I might add that that's not just true of the Arabs. As you look at Africa, which by 2050 will have 20% of the world's population, with 53 countries, 20% of the world's population. If you look at the percentage of followers of Islam, it'll be 1.6, 1.7 billion people out of a then population of 9. Not quite 20%, but growing very, very rapidly. That's a development that in this room we've not lived with. We'll be looking also at the development of the rights of women, thankfully, in terms of that change, in terms of governance. And so there are many things going on at the moment which clearly are going to impact the structure of the world in 2050. My own view is that it is wholly unlikely that the national structure in the Middle East will be the same. Wholly unlikely. If you take Saudi Arabia, where 50% of the wealth is in the hands of 5,000 princes and their related families, it can't last in my judgment. And there are many other aspects of the Middle East which, again, if we had time I could get into, but the whole issue of the Middle East, the Sunni and the Shia issues, the issue of Iran, are not trivial issues so far as we're concerned, even though they're on their way. They affect very much the energy in the world, they affect very much peace in the world. And so we as a country need to be better informed and be more in touch with what is happening in these countries, and not just by throwing in some troops, but by an education to see that members of Congress can think beyond the relatively short-term things that, I hate to say it, many of the congressmen think about, not you, of course, but many others in the Congress think very short-term and very politically, when the issues that our nation should be looking at is what the hell is going to happen in the next 20, 30 or 40 years.